these are some of the things that you have, again, wanted clarification. Some, like I said, have already been done. One of you actually asked about what is the difference in literature review and other review options. And I think that's a question that it should not be the purview of the talk today, because there's lots of material out there that we can share with you. Actually, there's a typology of 14 review options, of which literature review is one. And critical discourse that comes closest to it in literature review is actually, literature review is more limited to the focus that you want to take it on to a critical review. So critical review might go beyond the focus of your research question or research hypothesis or whatever you state. And you want some clearer understanding. You want an understanding of certain techniques and strategies, like difference between a research question and research problem. And I think that has been clarified in the material sent to you, and I would like us not to take up too much time, hypothesis development. And then you talk also about understanding various strategies. What is the, how do you prioritize and select the best sources? And then there are primary and secondary sources, as you know, and how to use where and what, and how to ensure objectivity. Here, I'd like to say that objectivity issue will be covered in the later session by Asif, and we should not try to give it too much time. And then, of course, where you say, okay, while you are doing this literature review, where do you draw a line? When is you say that this is enough for my research at hand and move on? And I think that's a very tough question, irrespective throughout the research. Where do you draw a line to say that we have done enough? And I think a lot of things as you go along in research, you will realize are beyond the scope, or even getting very broad in scope, and justifying them in your limitations will help you curtail yourself. So when in the first chapter you put up limitations, you might refine them as you do literature review and realize that you cannot cover everything. And you might rethink your hypothesis, you might rethink your research question, you might even rethink the scope of your study after a literature review. That's how fluid it is, that while you are working on the next steps of the research, you might be refining the initial plan that you had in your mind. And then a major part of your questions are about how to write a literature review. And here again, I will request Asif not to dwell too much, because writing of a literature review will depend a lot on the disciplines you belong to. And we do have sessions by discipline on how to write. So you will have later on in July a session on social sciences, humanities, and natural sciences writing. I do realize that we do not have one on how to write in computing disciplines, and we might add that at a later stage. And one of the questions was about that.
Thank you very much, Roxana. I'm just trying to look at some of the responses that you gave me, and I'll try to respond to some of them. If the participants have already looked at the video and have given attention to some of the topics that we discussed, then I'll just, as you said, skip the obvious and talk about some of the responses that I've received through you, which I found rather useful. One of which was, about identifying the gaps in literature review, and that's an important question, because as soon as you talk about literature review, uh, people, quite often new researchers at times, and even seasoned researchers will panic when they are faced with a new topic, slightly different topic. And the reason is that either you are very, very widely read on the topic yourself and you know much through your experience, or you need some kind of mechanism to fill in that gap. And quite often, what people don't realize, at least in our universities, and that's no fault of theirs either, it's primarily because library resources are not as developed in our country as they are abroad, which is one of the reasons this panic happens. So quite often in most of the disciplines, I can talk about 2 or 3 disciplines that I'm familiar with. You will have a specialized repertoire of resources, which one is expected to go through in any case for developing a literature review. For instance, I'll give an example. For instance, in Islamic studies, let's say, or in Islamic sciences, as soon as you want to write something, the first thing that you do, even before you look for the right person, and looking for the right person is very, very important. Even before you do that, you've selected a topic. Let's say, for instance, what was the one of the last papers that I supervised? Yes, it was by a girl student who was doing who had done her MPhil in Islamic studies. She was writing a paper on a woman's right to choose her husband and to send a proposal in Islamic traditions. Now, typically, people doing Islamic studies will just try to pick something up from the Quran, from the Hadith, look up a few books, but that's not a systematic way of doing things. You will, in any Western university, in any developed university, even in Malaysia, International Islamic University in Pakistan, a host of other universities in the Gulf regions and in the Western universities in US, Canada, particularly where I was educated. You will obviously first of all look at the established repertoire of sources. For instance, you would look at E.J. Brill's Encyclopedia of Islam, which will give you an overview of almost all that has been written thus far. It's updated on the topic by both by the Muslim scholarship and by the Western scholarship. You will typically also look at what is known as Index Islamicus, which is a source in English that gives you a list of all the reviews on any scholarly article that is written. We are all familiar with JSTOR and other resources. There are some informal, excellent resources. For instance, most of you know this because this is being recorded, so I'm not going to tell you, but you can always look up these resources. Every researcher knows about these resources where you find PDF, information. Pakistan, that becomes inevitable. It's out there. We have not done it. I'm not even kind of proselytizing here to look up those resources, but students do find that very useful. Scholars find that very useful. And apart from those sources, these ones which give proper indices of all that has been written, not just in terms of the articles or the books, but also the reviews written on them. For instance, Index Islamicus, which even LUMS has not been able to afford thus far. I don't think there's any university in Pakistan which Qaid-e-Azam library I know has a hard copy, but it's supposed to be, software which is updated almost every week. And you need to have that resource so that when you're writing, all you need to do is sit down when you have that resources, look up all the resources that have been, all the sources uh, on a particular work that has been produced, whether that be a book, on an article, you will find all the reviews written on it in one place. Similarly, there are very, similar sources, accompanying sources in German and French, which will give you similar information. So, in almost every field, every branch of knowledge, mathematics, philosophy, religion, literature, English literature, world literature, you'll find these works along with companion literatures. Oxford publishes companion, works. For instance, if you want to work on Indian Muslim history, there's an Oxford and a Cambridge companion to Indian Muslim history. And you'll find works by good scholars and also annotated bibliographies there. So some of these resources, If I were specifically telling you about research and supervising some research work, I would give you a list of those sources. For instance, I remember when I was training Ruxana's son, who was my student at LUMS. He wrote just one paper to be admitted on full scholarship to Harvard. He was already a brilliant student. But I remember, we made a list of all the sources where he could look for the sources, all the sources where he could look for the sources. And those are there. Unfortunately, even supervisors do not give this information. Science, pure sciences, mathematics, philosophy, religion, um, uh, literature, these are some of the areas I know have similar resources of not just encyclopedias which will give you annotated bibliographies. They would also give you indices on whatever has been produced. So that's the first step. And then, of course, one of the most important aspects is finding the right person. As Iqbal says, inkare hakimi nis damane kalimi gir. Yek bandai darya must, sad bandai sahil must, yek bandai darya must. I mean, you need a person who has himself jumped into the vortex to resolve the problems and has spent time. And how do you find that is also an important question. Uh, I've seen intelligent researchers spending a lot of time browsing through university websites, looking up profiles of professors in the relevant field, even in the Western universities. It's amazing how we don't tap these sources, because if you come across world-renowned scholars in your own field, you are quite often able to approach them. And people here, even professors, assistant professors, associate professors, they will ask this question: why will this person who's so renowned give me time? And here's why he would typically, if you have been able to zero in onto the right person or persons, and you spend some time reading that person's works, writing some kind of review or some kind of critique on it, and have used these resources like Index Islamicus, and I'm talking about the same field, and looked at what other scholars have written on him and done a comparative analysis, and then you write that person and tell him that you're interested in probing further in his work, you almost inevitably, and I've done that 101 times with my students who are aspiring candidates for their PhD programs, and quite often they will get immediate response and even interest and guidance from the professors. If you're already in the academia, they'll be very happy to respond to you, provided you've done that homework. So that's one of the questions that I've tried to respond to some extent, but I will now leave the rest to direct questions, and should like to respond to them.
Asif, you talked about databases and indexes as the first starting point. I see that not all of them are free, but I think libraries should carry those indices and databases. And I remember when I started my research, that's the first place where I went. And for my topic that I had selected, everything under the sun was in the form of a
Yes.
bibliography over there. The primary and the secondary sources, I think, basically. And I have also noticed that there was another, it's very long ago, but remind me, there's also a database for the theses that have been done around the world, especially in the West. Is that so?
Yes, that is correct. You can. I mean, it's not just that. There are organizations that will
Okay.
actually summarize theses for you. You pay them and they will do that, and that's okay. People do that all the time. But when you really want to kind of make your own intervention, one of the most relevant questions that is asked by reviewers, or in your defense, if you are presenting your dissertation or in a
Hmm.
conference paper by established scholars, is what your intervention is on a particular subject. Because
Hmm.
like there's this joke that if you copy from one book, it is plagiarism. If
Hmm.
you copy from many, it's a PhD. But PhD, but
Yeah.
PhD is supposed to be more than that. In our field, there are so many scholars, like I wouldn't name them well. They're well established scholars, but they've become very popular because they have this ability, this amazing ability to gather information from here, there, and they'll compile a book in no time and it will be published because they're still providing the lay reader with a lot of information put together.
Hmm.
But in a scholarly review, when you're establishing yourself as a scholar,
Hmm.
uh, reviewers are going to ask
Hmm.
what your intervention is. For
Hmm.
that, I mean, you might get some, basic ingredients through these organizations that summarize stuff for you. Uh, you get an idea, but to make an intervention, you have to delve into some original works on which you are
Hmm.
focusing, and you have to kind of digest them. So that you have to do. As
Hmm.
far as other theses and databases are concerned, yes, they are there, but unfortunately, and this is something we keep lamenting about. uh, I tried to do that at LUMS. I remember at a time when electronic databases and sources were not readily available. I used to keep asking them, and I still remember my binge about 20 years ago when I was given about 20 lakh rupees to buy books for LUMS in my field. But I realized that was just not enough because some of the Routledge series, a single book can cost you about 50 to 60,000 rupees.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
virtually peanuts.
Hmm.
And on the other hand, I remember when I was at McGill, there was one book which I wanted of a scholar by the name of Wahiduddin Khan, who's recently passed away. And I was looking for that book. And I was very worried that I wouldn't be able to find it. And I was sitting at my desk, and it took me about 20 minutes to find out that Harvard had one copy. And we have a system which is called ILL,
Yeah.
Interlibrary Loans.
Yeah.
And I just typed it, and it was university commitment throughout Canada and US
Yeah.
that I would have that book on my desk in 15 days, and I had it in
Yeah.
15 days.
Yeah. I
So,
know that that option is there, that
so,
you
so
can.
that
Yeah.
that is something which, unfortunately, even with whatever resources we have within universities, I mean, I've talked to my own university librarian a couple of times. Punjab History Library is a good source for old works in
Yeah.
history, and
Yeah.
but there is no good
Inter
system of,
share.
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we need to learn from each other. We need to, utilize each
Absolutely.
other's work.
So I think that's a good message for all of us going back, that we should try to put up a system of sharing and learning from each
And
other.
we have to
And
pressurize. We have to
yes,
pressurize teachers, researchers have to pressurize the administration. Look,
yes,
I really don't care. I teach at LUMS. I don't care if the building is nice or not. I would sit under a tree and be happier if I have these resources, and my
yeah,
students will be happier. So it really
yeah.
doesn't matter. These resources are far more important than the investments we make on buildings and grass and
Yeah.
whatnot.
So the starting point is having a good literature and body of literature within your hands, and knowing what to look at. And that you have done with looking at through indices, and then doing pinpointed research. There's a digital library, like you said, there's JSTOR, and those are free. So some of those researches you do. But I remember, Asif, when I was doing my research, one of the best ways of finding contemporary, I was told, was to look at an article by a renowned expert in that field, and then from there, from his bibliography, try to also locate other resources. Does that work well or no?
Yeah, that's like a patchwork kind of a
Okay.
thing, because
Okay.
when you don't have anything, that's one of the starting points, but it's not really the right way of doing research, because
Okay.
as a researcher, I mean, even in Pakistan, we're not interlinked, and we can't approach scholars directly through any kind of interface or any kind of forum where
Yeah.
I would access to different scholars directly through that forum. Even if I don't know the person, I should be able to just contact the person
Yeah.
or the library resources.
Yeah.
So we really have this problem. But some of the it's important to realize that many universities still have their search engines for their library resources open, so you don't get the book. For instance, at McGill, Harvard has closed it. At McGill site is called Muse, M-U-S-E, Muse,
Yeah.
and it's a huge site. Thousands of hundred thousands of books in some of the best known fields: medical science, engineering, social sciences. And what you do get is not the book itself,
Hmm.
but information on the book.
Hmm.
So you type a topic and you get information. It's not the same as Index Islamicus, for instance,
Hmm.
but or similar databases in different fields,
Yeah.
but it still gives you a very, very good idea. And similarly, window shopping, even through sources like Amazon, for instance, because you get information on the latest works that are available.
Hmm.
uh, you at least you're at least able to window shop and know what is out there.
Hmm.
Even the
Yeah.
title tells you something.
Yeah.
So just
So,
relying on one or two papers to make a list, jo aapko mil gaya, whatever you are able to lay your hands on, you do that. That's not enough.
yeah.
But we
We remember.
seriously need we
Do sorry.
seriously need to pressurize administration and uh, you know uh,
So
b-
the
b- b- change our
yeah.
outlook on how the funding is done.
Yeah. So the basic starting point is a good body of literature that you can access, and that we realize there was another question about how do you translate whatever body of knowledge that you have, and how do you justify it within your own cultural context or within your social context or whatever context? How do you do that in a literature review when you are?
That's that's a very, very important question. It's a very difficult question to respond to, but it's so important that if you really want to make a difference, this question has to be formally addressed. Quite often, when you're writing on your own culture and you want to publish internationally, uh, we all succumb to the temptation of going for what is the more fashionable. Let's take the example. I'll just give you an example from some of the fields that I'm interested in. Let's take the example of writing on, let's say, somebody like Ghulam Farid, an Urdu Saraiki poet. You know, you want to write on that. Now, there's a lot of literature, or you want to write on Ghalib. Now, somebody wants to write on Ghalib will immediately be inclined to look up, "Acha ji, Chicago has this, Berkeley has this, these are some of the people, CM Naeem, Shamsur Rahman Faruqi, these are some of the big names. You Umar Maiman, you pick up these names, you look at their works, Ralph Russell, Francis Pritchett,
Hmm.
and this is where you're getting your Ghalib from. But what about people like Ahmad Javed or Suhail Umar
Hmm.
or Dr. Zahid Munir Amir? Some of these people are right here, and we are not approaching them. So it's
Hmm.
very, very important to, when you're researching in your own area, to
Hmm.
go and meet people, to have that social interaction. I'll
Hmm.
tell you something very interesting. When Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was the founder of the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill, the oldest institution, mind you, on the American continent. It's a full-fledged institute. Some of its professors were responsible for founding the departments of comparative religions at Yale and Harvard and Chicago. And that's also an institute which boasted contributions by Dr. Fazlur Rahman, the person, not our Fazlur Rahman, the present Fazlur Rahman, Dr. Fazlur Rahman, the
Hmm.
person who was responsible at Ayub Khan's time for all those reforms, if I might use the word in inverted commas, in quotations. All these scholars were gathered there, and
Hmm.
Wilfred Quantrill Smith, by the way, used to teach at FC College before partition. One of the biggest names in the area of not just religious studies, but also in the area of textual studies, study of the text.
Hmm.
So he went there, founded this institute, and his idea was to found an institute where cultures could be integrated.
mm,
And what he made it a point to have, equal number of Muslim students, non-Muslim students from different. And what he used to do was to have once a week tea time at a place where some of the best scholars, would gather with students and socialize. We had something similar, as many of you already know, people my age would know, of Park Tea House and what kind of energy it produced, intellectual energy. Now, those are some of the things that we don't do anymore.
mm,
Sitting with scholars, spending with time with them, learning from them, and there's so much out there
mm,
which makes up for. I remember when I was doing my master's thesis, almost every scholar that I was writing on was a person I had spent a great deal of time with. I had learned directly from those people. So when my own supervisors would say, Kiniji, this is what this person says, no, like I know because you studied his book, I've studied under the person.
mm,
And that gives you a very different edge.
mm,
I have a friend who's just come back from Harvard. Used to be with me at McGill, and he did his research on ritualistic practices in hospices. Khanqah mein,
mm, mm,
Khanqahi Nizam mein, his PhD is a combination of anthropology and study of religion,
mm,
and he was able to do this amazing work. His name is Dr. Irfan Khan. He was able to do this amazing work because he was actually entrenched and invested in studying that directly through
mm,
scholars and through practitioners and through people involved.
mm.
And if we really want to have an edge, do something different than just have a number of publications on our portfolio,
Mm,
then we need
mm.
to invest ourselves that way as well.
Yeah. So you're talking about something like is getting a comeback in terms of oral histories and oral, involvement in digital humanities in way, though it's limited to humanities, but it applies to all disciplines. What is the oral language and oral research and how to sort of bring it into a research body? There are a couple of questions from the audience. One has raised a hand, but before we go there, very quickly, Asif, if you could talk about the value of a theoretical construct after literature review that you will guide your research. Because in Pakistan, I have noticed many. I read through a proposal, I read through, and I don't find a framework. There's no framework. It's just a mishmash of he said this, he said this, and then there is a consolidation of some data doing one thing or another without a framework. Could you please tell us how to develop a framework in a research literature review, and then what is the importance and how do you go from one step to that this step of theoretical construct,
Okay,
conceptual and
that's
theoretical both
again
actually.
a very interesting question. Researchers here in our academic culture are still at times, not all, especially in humanities, people are way ahead than they are in sciences. That's my own judgment. I might be wrong, but that's my feeling. In humanities, people do read a lot, so they're aware of what's happening and how thought process is done in research and then expressed. But really, when you go into that area of developing a framework, the first question that you have to ask yourself is, what is the kind of research you are doing? Because, for instance, if you are focusing on the whole process through what the reader would call deconstruction, you know, then the idea of research. I'll give you an example. Let me make it brief by giving you a concrete example. One of my colleagues at a research institute where I am a fellow, which is the highest research position at that institute. So another fellow who was doing his research for University of Wales had spent about 10 years studying Orientalist literature on the history of the Quran, and he was trying to kind of consolidate it. And the more he would do, the more difficult would it become, because every time new information and new data would add a dimension, and as you said, it would become it was very solid work, but he just wasn't able to understand how to put all of it together. So I discussed with him this idea, this postmodernist idea of deconstruction, because that is really valued. What really is deconstruction? Some of you would know, some might not, but very, very vaguely, you're talking about, doing research not to prove something as such, but to show that what had previously been understood, something like Popperian concept of falsification, something of that sort. You're trying to show that what was understood of a particular phenomenon through a particular construct of understanding might not be the univocal expression of the text. And by text, I mean anything that is interpreted, whether that be Taj Mahal or a piece of architecture. So, what you're trying to do is to show that what had been understood as the univocal expression or the univocal depiction of what might be termed as authorial intentionality is not perhaps the only possible way of looking at things. There are other possibilities as well. Something like like the work of Vail Halak in his very famous book now that has was recently published on the idea of an Islamic state, titled the Impossible State. So he's just trying to show that the construct that was made is perhaps not the only conception that was available, perhaps not even reifiable. So that kind of research will not typically end up concluding things in terms of having a concrete hypothesis and either proving it or disproving it. Research has gone way beyond that, but I can speak more on this if there are further questions.
Yeah, I think you raise an important question, because in our researches, we very briefly leave with areas for further research. But you're talking of something else. You're talking about how a research body itself actually does not go into the established proving or disproving of established research or frameworks or theories, but actually points of another direction in deconstructing. And I think that's a very interesting. I'd never thought of it
That's
before.
just one example. That's one example of
Yeah,
the possible ways of identifying your research problem.
yeah,
That's so it's not we have to go beyond uh, confining ourselves to scientific epistemes, not to disparage them at all, but
absolutely.
we have to think beyond those approaches of just having a hypothesis, proving, disproving, and that's research. No,
Yes,
it's much beyond that. So,
yeah,
I mean, we have to save ourselves from succumbing to what at times is called scientism. There are other
yes,
epistemes and there are other approaches available, and they can be sometimes very relevant. So,
yes,
first of all, we have to identify that and then see whether we were out there to prove or disprove something, or to identify newer ways of looking at things, newer ways of raising questions about certain constructs. If that is what,
mm,
if that is the kind of work you are doing, then it will require a different approach to develop the framework.
yeah.
Sometimes you don't end up concluding anything at all, but you have opened up the avenues to look at things from an entirely different angle and to do further research in that area.
Mhm. There's a question that now this is a very minor, this is a question of some techniques. Lots of techniques have been, strategies, smaller bite-sized questions, and I think those questions Dr. Nisar has asked, between a research article, literature review, and a conference paper, what is the difference, are some of the things that you can easily find on a Google Scholar. And I would not like us to sort of waste much time on that. There's a question from Bakhtavar,
Uh,
from
I'm sorry to cut you there, Ruxana. Just one comment on that question, because practically speaking, sometimes it can be a problem. Conference
G.
papers as opposed to research papers for me, because I've seen some colleagues suffer from that. I had a
G.
colleague at LUMS who invested a lot of time in conference papers, and at the end of it, 5 years down the road, 6 years, in your tenure,
Mhm.
the evaluation was not the same, and then the university people explained to him why it was not the same. So in that sense, it is a very relevant question. If I may just take a brief moment, when you're doing a conference paper, it's a kind of academic loud thinking. uh, you can have an idea and you want to formalize it as research. Obviously, you
Hmm.
have to pen down a couple of things. You're presenting in front of your peers, other scholars, with the purpose of receiving useful critiques,
Hmm.
which will help you to modify it into a formal paper.
Hmm.
So the way you're going to write a conference paper is going to be very, very different. I don't know how much time we have, but the mechanics become quite different as a consequence, as opposed to a formal research paper, where you have to cover certain bases which can be left uncharted. Even questions can be left uncharted, and sometimes the conference paper is just meant to solicit certain critiques which will help you to develop an idea.
Hmm.
So that primary difference has to be kept in mind.
There are two more hands raised up. One is from Bakhtavar. Please, Bakhtavar, unmute yourself and ask the question. And there's another one from Sobia.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am Ruxana. First of all, I'm really enjoying this discussion, and thank you, Sarasi, for pointing out some very important points that most people don't talk about.
Yes,
My
please
pleasure.
continue.
So it's true that we can access so many resources in Pakistan, but on the other hand, we also are not aware of many resources. First, you can access some resources, and the other is that you don't know the resources you can make use of. And when you talk about making the list of resources, how we can do that, and how we can make a list of sources when you don't know them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, that's a very important. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the famous lexicographer, made that comment about the lexicon that he was developing. He said knowledge is of two kinds. One is you know something, the other is you know where to look for it. And the second part, as you said, is a difficult job. But honestly, with all this development through internet and through all these media that are available to us right now, it's in some ways intimidating, because you want to be ahead of others and you don't want to reinvent the wheel. But at the same time, whatever is happening in Pakistan is happening to everybody. you know I mean, Lums inherited Khalid Isaaq's library. So people in my discipline in religious studies, we were very happy. But we are very, very well aware, most of us were educated abroad and here as well. But we are very, very well aware of both aspects. Number one, there is, I mean, my colleagues and I have been requesting. We are given about we have a small religious studies department at Lums, very small religious studies department, and we are given about 3 lakh rupees or something, 2 or 3 lakh rupees per month, or I don't know. I was leading the department about 3 years ago, so I don't know what the situation is right now for snacks. And quite often I said I would rather not have tea. Let me save this money. And in 5 years, for the money that was given for tea could have been perhaps used to buy at least 3 or 4 year subscription to Index Islamicus. I know it's an expensive thing, maybe about 15-20 lakh rupees, but maybe even if I had 3 years of subscription, I'd be a much happier person. I'd bring tea from home, you know. That problem is there. But despite this, what you can do is, as I said, you have to fish out, use the net, fish out for free, search engines that universities have. I gave you one example of Muse. You might not get the book, but you will get a response, some kind of good response to the first question, to the second question that Dr. Samuel Johnson talked about, where to look for things. Even if you're able to find out that this is out there somewhere, this new work has emerged, then the next task is to actually find some way of getting hold of that work. But the first task itself is no mean feat achieved. It's a huge achievement that you know what is the latest work. Secondly, I don't know how Facebook is used. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Facebook. I've made friends with so many scholars, helped out so many people, students through it. It's a very useful. I mean, that was the basic idea, when it was started at Harvard, to utilize such fora to gather information, and once you have information on what you're looking for, quite often you are able to find people who are willing to help and provide you some kind of PDF or something of that sort.
Hi, I'm Sophia. And I just, because you mentioned earlier that the book about the Islamic State and your friend's research on that, your colleagues' research. I'm an artist, and the problem with my work and my research is that I like to engage with the abstractions and, the poetics and the abstraction. And I just wanted to know that how is literature review different in artistic research? Because that's the area that I'm struggling with. Because there's a lot of and there's another question. I'm sorry. There's another question, which is that if you are producing very original knowledge, let's just say, which I borrow things from here and there to establish sort of a framework. But again, there's no literature produced, none in Pakistan on performance art. I'm not talking about performing arts, which is also, very limited, very, you would hardly find anything written on that. But I'm talking specifically about performance art, visual art. And the other problem is that if you're creating something very original, let's just say a very original discourse of knowledge, how do you then present your literature review? That's what I'm struggling with, and it would be, really great if you could expand on that.
That's a very good question, because it reminds me of a problem that I face. It might apply far more to art and to humanities than to other disciplines, but because I was trained both in social sciences and in humanities, so I think I should be able to respond to that to quite an extent. In my own area on which I focus, which is called hermeneutics, sometimes the art and science of interpretation of texts. So I deal with the classical texts, old texts. Sometimes some of the texts are the kinds of works that nobody has even deciphered. Nobody has read. There's no commentary on it. Nobody has even kind of like for recently, I did some translations of a work by Abu Rashid Nisaburi, who was Qadi Abu Bakr Jabbar's Qazi Abdul Jabbar's student, a Mu'tazilite philosopher, on internal debates between the Mu'tazilites, Iraqi and Baghdadi, Iraqi and Basri um, 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 scholars. Now, and similarly, at times you are working on scholars that nobody else has kind of worked on, or working on some aspects that nobody else has worked on. So I remember the first paper that I wrote for one of my supervisors, who really trained me. She was a professor emerita at McGill in her own area in Indian Muslim history, and one of the papers I wrote was on Maududi. And I had kind of interacted with Qazi Hussain at that time. I had interacted with the students directly, learned directly from them, from his own colleagues. So what I was writing on was very different from the political literature, because I was interested in his hermeneutics. And that's something that, except for Adam Smith, Charles Adams, who was the first director of the institute, who had written just about 2 papers. Nobody else had written on that area. So again, the same kind of question. Nobody else had written on that area. So I wrote my paper with just 2 sources cited, and the rest was my kind of. And my supervisor was very angry, and she said, what have you done? I mean, this is not a paper. This seems more like a reflection paper. And I said, nobody else has written about it. He says, that's perfectly okay. You are writing about something. This is all your original contribution. No one has even written about this. And later on, scholars of such high caliber as Sheila McDonough even acknowledged in their reviews on my paper that my contribution was unique and original. Nobody else had done that.
Wow.
But to do that, to make it presentable in the academia, as my supervisor trained me, I still had to place it historically to make other people understand it. Where am I placing it? For that, I need that secondary literature. Whatever original work I have produced, let's say, for instance, I'll give you another example. I critiqued the idea, the construction of ijma in Sunni epistemology. That's an important idea. Iqbal talked about it, but he did not go into the methodological and source criticism. It was just a philosophical critique that he did in his reconstruction, as many of you already know. So this is this is the gap that I try to fill in. And obviously, as a consequence, I received these reviews from international reviewers of very high caliber that it was a unique and original contribution. But to do that, of about 50, 60 pages that I wrote, my own contribution was just about maybe about put down in three pages. And for that, I had to work for about 6, 7 months. So whatever I'm doing, I'm still standing on shoulders of others. I have to show others. I mean, we're not working in vacuum, Here's the rest. Go, please. We have to show how what I'm working on has been historically placed. What is the surrounding ethos and surrounding milieu in which I'm looking at something? The moment I begin to analyze it, synthesize it, and interpret it, I have to do that vis-a-vis the tradition or traditions from which it has emerged. As Talal Asad puts it, I mean, in that discursive traditions, you are still responsible for letting your reader and reviewers know where exactly is this placed in the link, and how exactly is how exactly is it intertextual, to use the vocabulary of literary criticism, and how exactly it is adding to the link. So those are things in which you have to provide information through what has already been done in related areas for proper social, cultural, and historical contextualization.
Okay,
I hope
thank
I
you.
responded to some extent. Yes.
Asif,
Yes.
thank you so much. I think in responding to Sobia's question, I think Rabia Asim, you posed a question in the chat. What is your own proportion of personal idea and intervention? And I think Asif has very clearly defined how even in a discourse of so many pages, he had only 3 pages that were quite personal, and he had to justify what he was writing, which was original and not done before, on the basis of what had been written before, and he had to validate it. But we have launched the poll. While you are also, please, filling in the poll, which will just take a click, there's a hand by Wasim Hassan. Wasim Hassan, you are from University of Modern Languages, Namal. Please, what is your question?
I'm Wasim Hassan from National University of Modern Languages, and I'm working in the Department of English at the Lahore campus. Currently, I'm working on my doctoral thesis, and one thing which is related to the previous question asked by the previous participant, I basically my field is language documentation. I'm working on one dialect of Punjabi language. The problem which I am facing currently is there is not much work available on exactly the dialects of Punjabi languages. I mean, there was one work by Grierson that started in almost 1916. Uh, I mean, when he explored languages spoken in the subcontinent. After that, nobody bothered to work on languages. My question is, I find a very little material available on that dialect that I'm working on. When I express this that this is unexplored area, so my supervisor or the external reviewers, they would say this is a big statement. I mean, you cannot say this like. So the question is, where from? I mean, can I get literature in order to explain my work, or how can I solve this problem?
Yes.
Yeah, so
N- yes. This is an interesting question. But I remember about 15 years ago, there was so little work on Punjabi, but in the last 15 years, I'm myself amazed at how much work has been produced, and there's so much development that has taken place. I think you would have probably already seen Sardar Muhammad Khan's dictionary, which came out through Satchel publishers. Have you seen that?
Yes, sir. Uh, uh, but the point is,
It's
I'm
no,
just
no, I'm just trying to tell you that it was not available 10 years ago. You know, this
yeah.
this was not there. And I have specialized Punjabi dictionaries in different dialects, but some of the words of those dialects were not available in those specialized dictionaries, and I found them here. And the reason is, it's not the solution to your problem, but I'm saying that it did follow a certain approach, and the kind of approach that I'm talking about is, number one, using all that is available of, and you already would know what is available in your field. There are specialized dictionaries of Punjabi coming out already, which are helpful. Then you know the this other dictionary that you pointed out, that was there already. It was mostly a combination of Nagari and sorry, ये क्या है उसका वो
Gurmukhi and Gurmukhi.
Gurmukhi, yeah, Gurmukhi, and it was combining both together, as you would have seen. So later on, some of these dictionaries were added, so that repertoire is already there, and it's helpful. You do find a lot of things there, but I understand your problem. It's a unique problem. It's a very different kind of a problem, and I don't know if you're aware of a work done by Lane in Arabic. Uh, Lane spent about he was a lexicographer, and he spent about 50 years developing his lexicon, and I have a copy of that as well. And he did something similar to what you are doing. And you must study his approach, even in terms of formatting the dictionary and formatting the language. What he would do is that he would combine these resources, and this is how original works are done. You can make an amazing contribution, Wasim. Sometimes you have to, this is what he would do. He would combine all those resources. He was looking at Tajul Urus, he was looking at Lisanul Arab, he was looking at all the old dictionaries and understanding them. He was even going back to the original literature of, because that's how lexicon is developed. You don't just pick up dictionaries and copy dictionaries. You have to go back to the literature itself. He was looking at Hamasa, he was looking at Al-Mallaqatu Saba, he was looking at all those sources and studying the classical literature. But he didn't stop there. He started going to the tribes. He would spend time with tribes. I once met Maulana Tariq Jamil. We had a meeting, and many of you wouldn't know, he's very, very good at Arabic. Classical Arabic is very good. You might agree with him, might not disagree with him. I have 101 disagreements, but I respect him for that. And he was telling me how sometimes he was able to decipher these nuances of dialects only by going to the tribe and asking them for the meaning. So it's a unique kind of work that you're doing. I mean, if I had funding and I were doing that kind of work, I could spend, especially in Arabic, I could spend, the next 10 years of my life, if I had remained youthful enough to do that kind of work. But it's really unique. But you have to make that effort of using the repertoire, then going back as lexicographers do to the literature itself and deciphering that from the context of the literature, because a lot of things become clear through the context. But at times and Punjabi is a living language, you also have to go to the places and figure out from those people themselves.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks a lot.
It was not an easy question to answer, but this is not also easy kind of research.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I
Thanks,
think
sir.
those of you that are revisiting, you know, knowledge that has not ever been written or has been sort of put in a, included in a body of existing body of knowledge. I think that's a remarkable process. And I think, Sobia, your issue is partly related to that as well.
May I just, Roxana, very briefly make one final comment on Wasim's question? I found that very interesting. I hope Wasim will be able to be in touch because your area is of great interest to me. I teach a course at LUMS which is called Islamic Poesy in South Asia, tracing traditions of poetry in Persian, Hindi, Punjabi, and Urdu from 16th century up to modern times. There was a gentleman who came to Montreal from King's College who had done his PhD on Madhulal's kafis, Shah Hussein's kafis, and he did his research on the word, the lamentation, the wail of my knee, for instance, my knee mein kinnu aakha. So, and his whole thesis was centered around the idea of, and he was working on why, what does this invocation really connotate? And his thesis was that there are aspects of Oedipus complex which are reflected, and not. And I was like sitting with one of the proteges of Amina Wadud, and she was saying, "Why are you so upset?" And he said, "Look, I grew up in that culture. I know how young girls use this phrase as a cry of pain. I mean, he has done research on something that even a kid in that culture would understand. So there's so many things that when you have that luxury of research of that kind, then you can do amazing work, but you have to entrench yourself in that culture as well.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, that's the real hardcore kind of research which
Yeah.
makes breakthroughs.
Yeah. So you're talking about anthropology and anthropological Margaret Mead like sort of stuff where she goes and gets lost in tribes, which she is researching. Nukba actually wrote in her chat that on Punjabi, a lot of literature is in Indian universities like Amritsar. I am interested to know that she knows about this. So I think that's a very valid observation. That's a part of the Punjab probably that has retained a lot of its heritage in some way, which
Yeah,
we
and
haven't
we need to learn the script. I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, if you want to do Indian Muslim history, I mean, I can't. I mean, I had investigations by Internal Bureau to ask me why I learned Hindi, and why I was. But you need to learn. There's so much out there which we can't access because we can't read.
Yeah, that's true. And translations are but translations of that person.
Translations of a
Anyway,
translation.
yeah. So I don't see any other questions. We still have 90 of you with us. We had at one point over 130 or something, and they're from all over Pakistan. And I'm really delighted, Asif, that you could find time so we could learn from you. But when you start talking, I realize that I don't know anything. You go from one
No.
span of references of names to references of books to all sorts of areas where you are a true researcher, I think, of humanities, and
Just a very humble student.
yes, and you're still researching, but it's great to have you. And we are looking forward to the next session with you on research ethics. And I hope that we will learn some more, because a lot of questions today regarded how to validate your sources for literature review or otherwise will be covered in that. So please do join. Look forward to being with you all again. And Asif, thank you. Thank you again for your time and for your knowledge that you share with us. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.